Have you ever wondered what it would have been like to live in America's Gilded Age? It was a time of dazzling wealth and crushing poverty, of marble palaces and soot-blackened tenements, a time when men called robber barons sat at the top of the heap, while millions of others toiled in the muck below. The Vanderbilts were the crown jewel of this world, America's royal family. They built mansions larger than European castles, threw parties that outshone European courts, and married their daughters into actual royalty. But behind the glitter, there were broken marriages, lawsuits, scandals, and eventually a decline so steep that today many Vanderbilts are no richer than their neighbors. This is the story of how one family rose from a Dutch immigrant farmhand to control railroads, palaces, and high society, and how it all came crumbling down. If you're listening in bed with tired eyes and an overthinking brain, you're in the right place, so let this story carry you. And if you're still awake at the end, I'll be here to say goodnight. The story of America's so-called royal family doesn't actually begin with riches. It begins with a poor Dutch farmer named Jan Aerts, who, like so many dreamers of his time, set sail for the New World in the mid-1600s. His home was Debil, a small village in the Netherlands, and the name Vanderbilt simply meant from Debil. There was nothing royal about it. He wasn't carrying gold or titles across the Atlantic, just a willingness to work and the kind of desperation that pushes someone to leave everything they know behind. Jan arrived in New Amsterdam, which we now call New York, around 1650, and like many immigrants of his generation, he came with no money. To pay for his passage, he signed on as an indentured servant, essentially agreeing to years of hard labor in exchange for the chance to stand on American soil. It wasn't glamorous, but it was survival. Imagine trading 6 years of your life just to get a boat ticket, something we complain about today if it takes 2 minutes to load on a booking. When the English took over New Amsterdam in 1674 and renamed it New York, Jan's name was anglicized too. He and his family became Vanderbilt. It was less a royal rebranding and more a bureaucratic accident, but it stuck. From there, the Vanderbilts spent generations farming on Staten Island, quietly building nothing more exotic than potatoes and corn. For a long time, they were just another ordinary family. No mansions, no castles, no scandals splashed across newspapers. The dynasty hadn't yet begun, but the seed was planted, literally and figuratively. Because from this humble start, 2 centuries later, a Staten Island boy named Cornelius Vanderbilt would rise, using ferries, steamboats, and eventually railroads to transform the family name into one that symbolized power, extravagance, and unshakable ambition. And that boy, nicknamed the Commodore, would set in motion everything that followed. Cornelius Vanderbilt was born in 1795 on Staten Island, back when it wasn't the suburban commuter haven we picture today, but a scrappy farming community across the water from Manhattan. His parents were poor, not dirt floor poor, but certainly not the type to imagine their son would one day be the richest man in America. His mother ran a small ferry business across New York Harbor, and Cornelius, from the start, was more comfortable with boats than books. In fact, he left school at the age of 11. 11! At the age when most kids today are just learning to spell geometry, Cornelius was hauling ropes, shoving barges, and memorizing the tides of New York Harbor. He was a big, rough kid, broad-shouldered, and he quickly learned that survival wasn't about being the smartest in a classroom. It was about out-muscling your competition. At 16, Cornelius borrowed $100 from his parents, which, in the early 1800s, was no small sum. With that money, he bought a little sailing vessel called the Swiftsure and launched his own ferry service. Picture it, a teenager with a single boat, ferrying passengers and goods back and forth, haggling prices, cutting deals, and building a reputation as tough, reliable, and absolutely relentless. He would work sunrise to sunset, charging just enough less than competitors to steal their customers. a business model so timeless you can still see it today in budget airlines or streaming services. By 1817, Vanderbilt caught the attention of Thomas Gibbons, a steamboat operator who was more businessman than sailor. Gibbons was in the middle of a bitter, high-stakes war with the Ogden, who claimed they had an exclusive state license to run ferry traffic between New York and New Jersey. The Ogdens had received a charter from the state of New York, essentially giving them a legal monopoly over those waters. In practice, it meant anyone else trying to run a ferry without their blessing could be fined, sued, or shut down. They guarded that privilege fiercely, because control of the Hudson River ferries meant control of a golden artery of trade. Enter Gibbons, who refused to accept that a single family could control the busiest waterway on the eastern seaboard. He launched his own ferry service anyway, directly defying the Ogden, and he needed someone young, tough, and fearless to help him run it. That someone was Vanderbilt. Cornelius not only captained Gibbons' boats, but also became his enforcer and strategist. When Ogden's men tried to intimidate Gibbons' crews, Vanderbilt stood his ground. When the Ogdens tried to choke the business in court, Vanderbilt kept the ferries running. His job wasn't just to steer a boat, it was to learn how to outfight, undercut, and outlast the enemy. The conflict escalated through years of lawsuits, injunctions, and tense standoffs on the docks. Finally, the case reached the United States Supreme Court in 1824, Gibbons versus Ogden. Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that interstate commerce was under the authority of the federal government, not individual states. In one stroke, the Ogden monopoly was destroyed. For Vanderbilt, who had been in the thick of this war, the lesson was clear. Monopolies granted by governments could be toppled, but monopolies built by sheer ruthlessness, undercutting competitors until they broke, those could last. And he intended to build one of his own. After Gibbons, Cornelius struck out on his own. He became famous, or infamous, for undercutting competitors so savagely that some of them literally paid him to stop. He would drop his fares so low, even below cost, until the rival went bankrupt, then jack the prices back up once he owned the route. Think of it as the 19th century version of an Amazon price war, except instead of free 2-day shipping, you got a wooden bench on a crowded steamboat that might or might not explode. By the 1830s and 1840s, Vanderbilt wasn't just running ferries. He was running entire fleets of steamboats up and down the East Coast. He earned his nickname, the Commodore, not from any official naval title, but because his empire of ships was larger than some national navies. And unlike many wealthy men of his era, Vanderbilt didn't spend much of this fortune on himself. He was famously Spartan, plain clothes, simple meals, little interest in fine art or high society. He built an enormous fortune, but lived like a man who still had to row his own boat. His idea of a good dinner was cold beans eaten straight from... Of course, that discipline didn't extend to his family. Vanderbilt was notoriously cruel to his wife Sophia, with whom he had 13 children. He belittled her, controlled her, and eventually forced her into an asylum when she became inconvenient. To his sons he was equally hard, often dismissing them as weak or unworthy. His philosophy was blunt. If I had learned education, I would have been a damn fool. That was the standard he held his children to. Toughness, not intellect, not kindness. As America expanded westward, Vanderbilt followed the money. During the California gold rush, when thousands of fortune seekers were desperate to get from the East Coast to San Francisco, Vanderbilt created shipping routes through Nicaragua and Panama, cutting weeks off the traditional voyage around South America. For a time, he dreamed of building a canal through Nicaragua, a vision that predated the Panama Canal by decades. But that particular dream was swallowed by politics and rivalries. Still, Vanderbilt made millions off the gold rush, positioning himself as a master of moving people and goods faster, cheaper, and more ruthlessly than anyone else. But the true pivot in his empire came when he turned from the water to the rails. By the 1850s and 1860s, Steamboats were old news, but railroads were the arteries of America's growing economy. Vanderbilt sold off much of his shipping empire and poured his fortune into railroads, staging hostile takeovers of failing lines and welding them into a unified system. He gobbled up the Harlem Railroad, forced his way into the New York Central, and stitched together networks that spanned from New York to Chicago. This was classic Vanderbilt style, not building new lines, but taking over and consolidating what others had started, then making it profitable by sheer force of will. In 1871, he built the Grand Central Depot, the ancestor of today's Grand Central Terminal, a cathedral of transportation in Manhattan. By the time he was in his 70s, Vanderbilt had transformed himself from a Staten Island ferry boy into the undisputed king of American transportation. His fortune was so vast that when he died in 1877, he was worth $15 million, about $3 billion in today's money, making him the richest man in America. But his story wasn't just about making money. It was also about shaping America itself. Every train that left Grand Central, every shipment that arrived in New York Harbor, carried a little of Vanderbilt's ruthless spirit with it. He embodied the raw, unsentimental capitalism of the 19th century, brilliant, brutal, and utterly unapologetic. And of course, he left his family with not only staggering wealth, but also staggering dysfunction. His will gave 95% of his fortune to a single son, William Henry Billy Vanderbilt, triggering lawsuits and bitterness that would ripple through generations. It was the beginning of both the glory and the downfall of the Vanderbilts. When Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, died in 1877, the fortune he left behind was staggering. Adjusted for today's dollars, it was around $3 billion. But here's the part that shocked even his own family. He left 95% of it to just one son, William Henry Vanderbilt, better known as Billy. This was not a vote of affection. The Commodore wasn't exactly the warm, sentimental type. It was a cold calculation. He thought Billy was the only one with enough spine, discipline, and business acumen to keep the empire intact. And to Billy's credit, he proved his father right. Billy had grown up under the shadow of a man who thought almost all of his children were disappointments. The Commodore routinely insulted Billy, belittled him, and even told him he was too soft for business. For years, Billy quietly tried to prove himself, managing a Long Island farm his father bought, learning the ropes of administration. The Commodore finally noticed his eldest son wasn't as useless as he had thought, and Billy rose in his father's esteem. By the time the will was read, Billy inherited not only the family empire, but also the crushing responsibility of maintaining it. And maintain it he did, spectacularly. In less than a decade, Billy doubled the family fortune. He expanded the New York Central Railroad system, tightened efficiency, and bought up more lines. He turned the family's already massive wealth into an even greater empire of steel and steam. His work ethic was brutal, dawn-to-dusk meetings, obsessive control, and relentless focus on the bottom line. But Billy also gave the world one of the most infamous sound bites of the 19th century. In an interview with a reporter, he was asked whether the railroads should consider public opinion when making decisions, especially since they had near monopoly power. Billy shrugged and replied, "The public be damned." It was the kind of quote you can't take back, and newspapers feasted on it. Suddenly, Billy was the living embodiment of the callous, greedy capitalist, the man who had so much money he didn't even care about the people who gave it to him. To be fair, he later claimed he was misquoted, insisting he only meant that railroads were private businesses, not public charities. But the damage was done. The phrase stuck to his name like a tattoo. While he ran railroads with ruthless efficiency, Billy also built monuments to the Vanderbilt wealth. Most famously, he constructed what became known as the Triple Palace on Fifth Avenue in New York. Unlike his father, who lived simply and spent little, Billy embraced the Gilded Age culture of display. The Triple Palace wasn't just one mansion. It was 3 interconnected mansions taking up an entire block. Billy, his wife, and 2 of his sons all had their own palatial residences under one enormous roofline. Imagine a McMansion cul-de-sac, but instead of cul-de-sac, it's Fifth Avenue. And instead of 2-car garages, it's ballrooms dripping in gold. If Instagram had existed back then, the Vanderbilts wouldn't just have dominated the feed, they would have been the feed. Billy also poured money into art, philanthropy, and social influence, determined to elevate the family into America's aristocracy. Where the Commodore had been a gruff outsider who made his fortune through sheer grit, Billy wanted refinement. He wanted to prove the Vanderbilts weren't just rich. They were cultured, respectable, and permanent. Still, there were cracks under all that marble. Billy's relationship with the public was forever poisoned by his public be damned remark, and his obsession with cementing the Vanderbilt name in high society created rivalries within New York's elite. The famous 400, Mrs. Astor's carefully curated list of New York's social aristocracy didn't always welcome the Vanderbilts with open arms. Money could buy mansions, jewels, and entire blocks of Fifth Avenue, but it couldn't always buy respect. Billy Vanderbilt died in 1885, just 8 years after inheriting his father's empire, at the relatively young age of 64. But in that short window, he doubled the fortune, reshaped New York, and left behind the kind of reputation that was equal parts awe and disgust. To some, he was the genius heir who proved his father right. To others, he was the face of everything heartless and arrogant about the Gilded Age elite. And perhaps most tellingly, his children would carry on not just his fortune, but his hunger for excess, building even bigger mansions, throwing even gaudier parties, and marrying into even more scandal. Because if Cornelius Vanderbilt had built the money, and Billy had doubled it, the next generation of Vanderbilts were about to figure out the most enjoyable part of being rich: spending it. If Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, represented the muscle, and Billy Vanderbilt represented the management, then the next generation of Vanderbilts represented the spectacle. Because what's the point of having the largest fortune in America if you can't rub it in everyone's face? By the late 1800s, Fifth Avenue in New York had become the Vanderbilts' playground. They weren't content with 1 or 2 mansions. Entire city blocks were swallowed whole. The so-called Triple Palace was already outrageous. But then came houses so opulent, they made European royalty look frugal. Marble facades, ballrooms that could fit hundreds of guests, staircases designed to sweep gowns into motion like choreographed theatre. The Vanderbilts weren't just building homes, they were staging performances in stone. And the crown jewel of this performance, the infamous balls. Take Alva Vanderbilt's Masquerade Ball of 1883, still remembered as the party that forced Mrs. Astor, the grand gatekeeper of New York society, to finally acknowledge the Vanderbilts. Until then, Mrs. Astor had looked down her nose at them. Old money considered the Vanderbilts vulgar, too new, too brash, too eager. They might have owned railroads and steamboats, but they didn't own a lineage. Alva decided to change that, not with a polite tea or dinner party, but with a spectacle so massive that even the Astors couldn't afford to ignore it. She spent what would be millions today transforming her mansion into a fantasy land. 400 of New York's most glittering names received invitations, and no expense was spared. Guests wore costumes dripping in jewels, feathers, and imported silks. Servants glided around in livery. Champagne fountains spilled over like indoor waterfalls. The most famous gown of the night belonged to Alva's sister-in-law, Alice Claypool Vanderbilt. She arrived dressed as an electric light. Yes, an electric light. In a gown wired with actual light bulbs. She glowed, literally, at a time when electricity itself was still a novelty. It was as if someone showed up to the Met Gala today dressed as a fully functioning Tesla Model S and plugged into the wall for effect. Subtle? Not even close. But unforgettable? Absolutely. And it worked. The next day, Mrs. Astor, who had been clinging to her 400 list of acceptable names, was forced to acknowledge the Vanderbilts. The guest list for New York's elite had to make room for them, whether old money liked it or not. As one social commentator put it, the Vanderbilts had bought their way into society not with dollars, but with diamonds and daring. But here's the irony. While they were dazzling their peers with electric gowns and masquerade balls, much of the city outside their marble walls lived in tenements barely fit for animals. While guests floated in crystal-lit ballrooms, factory workers sweated 14 hours a day in locked buildings that sometimes caught fire. It was a contrast so sharp that it bordered on satire. Imagine hosting the world's most glittering ball, while, a few blocks away, families were boiling cabbage water because that's all they had for dinner. The Vanderbilts weren't ignorant of this contrast. They simply didn't care. Or perhaps more charitably, they believed their display of wealth was a kind of civic contribution. By throwing such spectacular parties, they weren't just entertaining themselves, they were advancing civilization. At least, that's how they spun it. It was the Gilded Age version of influencers today, insisting that their vacation vlogs are for inspiration. What's undeniable is that the Vanderbilts redefined high society in America. They imported European grandeur, married it to American ambition, and then added a dash of theatricality that only a country obsessed with novelty. Their balls became legends, their mansions landmarks, their jewels conversation pieces. But here's the thing about spectacle. They're expensive to maintain. And while the Vanderbilts were experts at building railroads and mansions, they were not always experts at holding on to their money. Because soon, the next generation of Vanderbilts would show that while it's one thing to build a fortune, it's quite another to preserve it. So, while the Vanderbilts were busy electrifying their gowns and pouring champagne into literal fountains, what was life like for the people at the other end of the Gilded Age? Spoiler alert, it was less masquerade ball and more don't die of typhoid before Wednesday. Factories were the beating, smoke-choked heart of America. Imagine waking up at 5 a.m., grabbing a hunk of bread, and then trudging into a factory where the air was so thick with soot you could chew it. You'd work 12 to 14 hours a day, not for stock options, not for career growth, but for a handful of coins. If you were really lucky, you got paid in actual money instead of company script. You could only spend at the factory store. Imagine your boss handing you monopoly money on payday and then charging you triple for bread. That was real life. And if you think kids had it easier, nope. Child labor wasn't an occasional scandal. It was normal. Little boys and girls, some barely tall enough to see over a workbench, were sent into coal mines, textile mills, and factories. Why? Because their tiny hands could reach into machines adults couldn't. Today we brag when a kid learns coding at 12. In 1880, parents bragged that little Johnny hadn't lost more than 2 fingers at the mill. Then there were the tenements. Overcrowded apartment buildings where poor families crammed 6, 8, sometimes 10 people into a single room. No plumbing, no ventilation, no privacy. Disease ran rampant. Tuberculosis, cholera, measles. If you survived to adulthood in a tenement, you were basically a statistical miracle, and yet, millions lived this way. Here's the kicker. While the Vanderbilts were hosting costume balls on Fifth Avenue, workers in places like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory were being locked inside their workplaces to prevent theft. When fire broke out in 1911, 146 workers, most of them immigrant women and girls, died because the doors were chained shut. Meanwhile, just a few miles uptown, society was debating which family had the larger ballroom chandelier. It was the ultimate split screen. Upstairs glitter, downstairs grit. Or to put it in modern terms, the Vanderbilts were living like Kardashian, and everyone else was stuck in a season of Survivor, where the prize was not starving. So yes, the Gilded Age had its glitter, but the shine only worked because millions of others were kept in the shadows, and those shadows were dark, crowded, and often deadly. The Gilded Age looked like a golden buffet if you were rich, white, and preferably male. For everyone else, not so much. Let's start with women. High society women, think Vanderbilts in gowns stitched with actual jewels, had roles. And by roles I mean look dazzling, marry well, host dinners where the seating chart was basically international diplomacy, and produce heirs. A daughter's worth was measured in carats, not character. Mothers like Alva Vanderbilt treated their girls less like daughters and more like chess pieces in the great marriage market. Imagine being grounded, not because you broke curfew, but because you refused to marry a duke. Meanwhile, women lower on the social ladder had a very different reality. They weren't at masquerade balls, they were working in textile mills, scrubbing laundry, or taking in sewing to scrape by. Some were domestic servants in the very mansions that hosted glittering galas, silently topping up champagne glasses, while society guests debated which tiara sparkled more under the gaslight. Let's be honest, if Downton Abbey had been set in New York in 1883, the downstairs staff would have been coughing from coal dust, while upstairs argued about which Vanderbilt ball was tackier. Now, let's talk about race. For Black Americans, the Civil War was over, but freedom didn't exactly come with an instruction manual or economic safety. The Gilded Age overlapped with the Jim Crow era in the South, where segregation laws spread like weeds. Opportunities for Black Americans were brutally limited, but that didn't mean there weren't success stories. Entrepreneurs like Madam C.J. Walker's predecessor and educators like Booker T. Washington carved out spaces of progress. Black newspapers, schools, and businesses were lifelines in communities that the mainstream economy happily ignored. Still, the contrast was staggering. Cornelius Vanderbilt could spend millions on a mansion fountain, while black families in the South were still fighting for access to schools that weren't collapsing. It's like today's world of billionaires launching themselves into space, while some people can't afford a dentist. And then there were immigrants, Italians, Irish, Eastern Europeans, pouring into cities and living in those infamous tenements. They built the railroads, manned the factories, and got sneered at in the newspaper. To the old money elite, these new arrivals were unwashed masses. Irony alert. This was usually said at dinner parties, while their servants, many of them immigrants, were literally washing the dishes in the back. The Gilded Age, in short, was a tale of two realities: the ballrooms and the breadline, the Astors and the alleyways. Women, Black American, immigrants, they were present, vital, and essential to the story. But society treated them as background extras in the great theatre of wealth. It's a reminder that gilded doesn't mean golden. It means a thin layer of gold painted over something much less shiny underneath. For all its sparkle, the Gilded Age wasn't exactly bulletproof. The gold paint began to chip, and what lay underneath looked less like Versailles and more like a rusted fire escape. First came the financial panics, 1873, 1893, when the whole economy basically hit the blue screen of death. Banks collapsed, railroads defaulted, and suddenly those endless champagne fountains looked a little ridiculous. Imagine spending millions building a mansion with a marble staircase wide enough to land a Zeppelin, and then realizing you might not be able to make payroll for your servants next week. The Vanderbilts kept their palaces, of course, but thousands of smaller investors and workers got crushed. Then there were the strikes. When you pay people pennies and work them to the bone, they eventually notice. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 saw workers walk off the job in cities across the country. Trains were halted, clashes broke out, and the National Guard was called in. The rich wrung their hands about law and order, while workers were literally being shot for demanding an 8-hour day. Picture it as the Gilded Age version of a bad Glassdoor review, except instead of quitting, you got bayonets. In Chicago, things boiled over during the Haymarket Riot of 1886. What started as a peaceful rally for labor rights turned violent after a bomb went, killing police and protesters alike. Newspapers painted labor leaders as anarchists, while the rich muttered that workers simply didn't appreciate the privilege of breathing factory smoke for 14 hours. And yet, whispers of reform began to take hold. Journalists known as muckrakers started poking around, exposing tenement filth, child labor, and political corruption. Think of them as the Gilded Age equivalent of today's investigative podcasts. But instead of going viral on Twitter, they landed front-page spreads in newspapers read by the very people they were skewering. Even the government, famously sluggish in this period, stirred. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 was meant to regulate railroads, a polite way of saying Vanderbilt, calm down, and the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 aimed to curb monopoly. Did they work immediately? Not really, but they planted seeds. Seeds that would grow into the progressive era, when reformers actually managed to pry a few gold-plated fingers off the levers of power. In short, the Gilded Age glittered, but it wasn't invincible. Behind the marble facades and diamond tiaras, you could hear the faint but growing sound of unrest. Strikes, reformers, journalists tapping at their typewriters. The cracks in the gold were spreading. By the early 20th century, the Vanderbilt family had perfected the art of showing off. They had the mansions, the jewels, the balls, the yachts. But what they didn't have was subtlety. That, thankfully, came in the form of Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, the heiress who decided she wasn't going to be just another rich wife with pearls the size of plums. Gertrude was born in 1875 into all the glitter and excess of Vanderbilt privilege, but instead of simply smiling for society photographers and hosting teas, she did something shocking. She wanted to work, not manage the servants' work, not arrange the flower vases work, actual creative, dirty your hands work. Gertrude became a sculptor. Now you can imagine how this went down at the dinner table. Vanderbilt women were supposed to sparkle in diamonds, not chip marble dust out of their fingernail. But Gertrude didn't care. She studied art seriously, even opening her own studio under an alias so critics wouldn't dismiss her as just another rich dilettante. Dry humor mode. Imagine being so rich you have to pretend to be poor just to be taken seriously. But she wasn't just making busts of society ladies. Gertrude used her money and influence to support other artists, particularly women, who didn't have a Vanderbilt bank account to fall back on. Her Greenwich Village studio became a hub for creativity and rebellion, an alternate universe from her family's marble halls. Then came World War I. While much of her family continued hosting glittering parties, Gertrude rolled up her sleeves and funded actual field hospitals in France. She didn't just donate, she ran them, working with doctors and nurses, providing care for wounded soldiers. She turned her fortune into relief, not just tiaras, and she left her mark in stone as well. She designed several major monuments, including the haunting Titanic Memorial in Washington, D.C. Imagine this. While her cousins were still arguing about who had the better ballroom ceiling fresco, Gertrude was building a national monument to one of the greatest tragedies of the modern age. But her most delicious act of rebellion came in the 1920s, when she tried to donate her growing collection of American art to the Metropolitan Museum. The Met sniffed and declined. American artists, they insisted, weren't worth the space. Gertrude's response, "Fine, I'll start my own museum." And she did. The Whitney Museum of American Art opened in 1931. Today, it's one of the world's leading art institutions, but it began as a Vanderbilt heiress essentially saying, "If you don't want my collection, I'll just build my own clubhouse." It was the ultimate flex. Imagine being so rich you can start a museum out of spite. Gertrude proved that Vanderbilt wealth didn't have to just sit in marble ballrooms or fade into gossip columns. It could actually create something enduring, not just excess, but culture. She reinvented what it meant to be an heiress, carving out, literally, her own legacy with chisel and stone. If Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney showed the world that an heiress could use her fortune for art and culture, her cousins showed the world something else entirely, that when you mix obscene wealth with boredom, you get scandals big enough to fill entire newspapers. The most infamous of these was Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt. Born with every advantage, Alfred seemed determined to turn life into one long, expensive weekend. He was skull and bones at Yale, a club already notorious for turning privilege into an extracurricular activity. He loved fast horses, faster yachts, and the kind of gambling that makes Vegas casinos look cautious. If Instagram had existed back then, Alfred would have been that guy posting shirtless yacht selfies, while everyone in the comments whispered, "Isn't he supposed to be married?" But his Playboy lifestyle wasn't his only headline. In 1915, Alfred booked passage on the RMS Lusitania, a luxury liner torpedoed by a German U-boat off the coast of Ireland during World War I. Unlike some Vanderbilts, Alfred rose to the moment. Eyewitnesses reported he gave up his life jacket and helped women and children into lifeboats. He didn't survive. He was just 37. It was a shocking twist. The ultimate society playboy dying as a hero. One newspaper called it the noblest ending for the most gilded life. And Alfred wasn't the only scandal in the family. Other Vanderbilts managed to burn through fortunes faster than their ancestors built them. Some fell for Ponzi schemes. Yes, Ponzi scheme, as in Charles Ponzi, the original scammer whose name still defines pyramid schemes today. Imagine being so rich you could bankroll the scam that invented the word Ponzi. Others drank away their fortune, gambled them, or simply married the wrong people. Affairs were constant. There were suicides that shocked even jaded gossip columns. Lawsuits flared up regularly, over wills, over inheritances, over who got the bigger mansion on Fifth Avenue. If TMZ had been around in 1910, the Vanderbilt surname alone could have fueled their business model for decades. The irony is that while Cornelius, the Commodore, had pinched pennies so tightly he sometimes walked instead of hiring a carriage, his grandchildren were spending millions just to throw a weekend party. It was the family fortune as a trust fund teenager, rich, reckless, and in the headlines for all the wrong reasons. This was the other side of the Gilded Age legacy. Not art, not philanthropy, not even railroad, just champagne baths, scandal sheets, and the constant hum of a family that had too much money and too little restraint. If the Vanderbilts started with steamships and railroads, by the 20th century their empire had burned down to something much stranger, a custody trial that the press called the trial of the century, and at the center of it was a little girl named Gloria Laura Vanderbilt. Gloria was born in 1924 to Reginald Vanderbilt, who had drunk himself into the grave by the age of 45, and Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, a glamorous but wildly irresponsible young widow. When Reginald died, baby Gloria inherited a $5 million trust fund, the equivalent of around $80 million today. Not bad for a toddler, but since toddlers aren't particularly good with money, her mother controlled it. That's where things got messy. Gloria Morgan spent lavishly, yachts, parties, trips to Europe, while leaving her daughter in the care of a nanny. Enter Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, the sculptor and museum founder from earlier, who decided enough was enough. In 1934, she sued for custody of little Gloria, arguing that her mother was unfit. The trial quickly devolved into a media circus. Reporters packed the courtroom, splashing headlines about alleged affairs, neglect, and whispered scandals. At one point, the child herself was brought to testify. The nation was riveted. In the end, Gertrude won custody, and Gloria was raised in her household. The case cemented the Vanderbilt name not as titans of railroads or hosts of grand balls, but as the ultimate fodder for gossip columns. The richest family in America had become a soap opera, and Gloria, she grew up and refused to play the role of quiet heiress. Instead, she became a model, actress, writer, and eventually fashion designer. By the 1970s, she launched her line of tight-fitting designer jeans, and they were a sensation. Those little swan logo jeans turned Gloria into one of the first celebrity fashion brands, from castles and railroads to couture denim. It was the full arc of the Vanderbilts in one life. Her personal life was equally headline-worthy. Lovers included Frank Sinatra, Marlon Brando, Howard Hughes, and Roald Dahl. Her marriages, 4 of them, were rocky, but her children defined her later years. One of her sons, Carter, tragically died by suicide in 1988, a loss Gloria carried with heartbreaking openness. Another son, of course, is Anderson Cooper, the CNN anchor who later co-authored a book with her reflecting on the Vanderbilt legacy. By the time Gloria died in 2019, at age 95, she was celebrated not just as an heiress, but as a survivor, a reinvention artist who outlived the scandals and turned herself into something beyond her name. She was, in many ways, the last glittering flame of the dynasty. From steamships to jeans, from Grand Central Depot to cable news, the Vanderbilt's story ends not with railroads, but with a woman who made herself relevant in every era she lived through. By the mid-20th century, the Vanderbilt family itself was fading, but their houses, oh the houses, refused to quietly disappear. These weren't just homes. They were architectural flexes, monuments to a kind of wealth America hadn't seen before and probably won't see again. The crown jewel was Biltmore Estate, built by George Washington Vanderbilt II in Asheville, North Carolina. Opened in 1895, it was, and still is, the largest privately owned home in the United States. Think 250 rooms, 65 fireplaces, a banquet hall with a ceiling so high it could practically host hot air balloons, and a library stocked with 20,000 books because George liked to read in bulk. Surrounding it all, 125,000 acres of landscaped grounds designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, the guy who also designed Central Park. In other words, this wasn't a home, it was a lifestyle theme park, and yet, the very scale of Biltmore became a curse. Maintaining it cost a fortune, and the family fortune was already cracking. During the Depression, the Vanderbilts actually opened Biltmore to paying visitors, not out of generosity, but out of necessity. The irony is rich. The same family that once shut the gates to anyone without an invitation now had to hang a sign out front saying, $2 for a tour, come gawk at our chandeliers. Today, it's still a tourist attraction, though admission is closer to $40, and you can buy a bottle of Biltmore branded wine on your way out. Nothing says decline like selling Merlot with your crest on it. Then there was the Breakers, Cornelius II's Newport Palace, built with Italian marble, gold leaf, and a dining room that could seat an entire minor European court. The Breakers became the ultimate summer house, but the family eventually couldn't afford to live there either. In the 1940s, the Vanderbilts leased it to the Preservation Society of Newport for $1 a year. Imagine, the same place that once required a guest list tighter than the Met Gala was now being kept alive with dollar store rent. Many of the other Fifth Avenue mansions didn't survive at all. The so-called Triple Palace, torn down to make room for commercial building. Whole stretches of Vanderbilt Row vanished under the wrecking. What were once temples to excess are now office towers and luxury condos. The family that defined the skyline of New York left almost nothing of it behind. What remains are the ghosts, Biltmore, the Breakers, and a handful of other houses that now exist as museums or tourist attractions. Their chandeliers still glitter, but not for Vanderbilt guests. They glitter for bus tours. Their ballrooms echo not with orchestras, but with the shuffle of sneakers. Their gilded dining tables are roped off so you can't put your elbows on them. It's beautiful, yes, but also strangely hollow. The Vanderbilts' palaces endure, but the Vanderbilts themselves, mostly gone, their fortunes dissipated into lawsuits, taxes, and history. By the mid-20th century, the Vanderbilt story had come full circle. From Cornelius, the Commodore, who started with a $100 loan to buy a ferry, to Gloria Vanderbilt, who turned her name into a fashion label, the family had built the greatest fortune America had ever seen. and then spent it, sued it, and taxed it out of existence. The New York Central Railroad, the jewel of the dynasty, passed from Cornelius to Billy to Cornelius II, and then down the line. By the time it reached Harold Vanderbilt, there were no sons left willing or able to run it. In 1954, financier Robert R. Young staged a hostile takeover of the company. The dynasty's core was gone. The money went next. Estate taxes, divorces, bad investments, and the sheer cost of keeping up palaces the size of small countries ate through fortunes faster than new businesses could replenish them. The Vanderbilts went from the richest family in America to just rich, then just comfortable, and eventually many of them were just ordinary people with extraordinary last names. By the 1970s, one Vanderbilt descendant was driving a New York City taxi. Another was writing comic novels that barely sold. The irony is brutal. They had built America's railroad, reshaped its cities, dazzled its society, and yet couldn't hold on to the crown. The Vanderbilts proved that you can build an empire with steel and steam, but you can't stop the slow grind of time, taxes, and excess. Today, their mansions are museums, their name is history, and their fortune has scattered like champagne bubbles fading into air. So, what do we take from the Vanderbilts? That money can build palaces, but it can't guarantee wisdom. That railroads and fortunes can fade, but a name, especially one stamped on enough mansions, museums, and gossip columns, can linger long after the last dollar is gone. The Vanderbilts were America's royal family, but theirs was a crown made of paper and gold leaf. It gleamed for a time, but it wasn't built to last. And maybe that's why their story still fascinates us, because it's not just a story of wealth. It's a story of ambition, reinvention, scandal, tragedy, and decline. In other words, it's the most American story there is. So as you close your eyes tonight, picture the chandeliers of the Breakers, the endless halls of Biltmore, and the glitter of gowns at Alva's masquerade ball. But also, remember the workers in the tenements, the scandals in the tabloids, and the quiet, ordinary Vanderbilts who ended up far from the empire their ancestors built. Thank you for spending this journey through the Gilded Age with me. If you enjoyed it, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. It helps keep this channel and these long-forgotten stories alive. Good night.